Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the really intense psychological burden of being the golden child, and specifically how those early family dynamics are probably actively shaping your burnout right now as an adult. If you've ever felt like your success is, completely driven by this exhausting, invisible engine that you just can't seem to turn off, well, you are in exactly the right place. We're going to dissect a very specific psychological pipeline, going from a parentified child to a high-achieving but incredibly heavily burdened adult.
Now, take a look at this phrase, biological noise-canceling device. It's so striking, right? Because it just perfectly captures the reality of an adult who is constantly absorbing and silencing the emotional chaos of everyone around them. I mean, think about how an actual noise-canceling headphone works. It doesn't just put up a wall to block sound. It actively listens to the chaotic frequencies around it, and then literally produces an inverse wave to neutralize them. And that takes constant energy. So, if you are the psychological equivalent of that device for your family, your friends, or even your workplace, you are constantly reading the room. You're assessing the emotional static and generating the exact right energy to smooth the whole thing out. It is a brilliant skill, absolutely. But as we're going to see, it just runs your internal battery straight down to zero.
All right, let's move into Section 1, the 7-year-old fixer, from childhood origins to adult realities.
This really illustrates the profound evolution we're talking about here. Look over on the left. What begins as stepping up to fix family issues at literally 7 years old. Maybe you were mediating arguments between your parents or taking on emotional duties way above your pay grade. Well, that doesn't just magically stay in childhood. It morphs directly into what we see on the right, an adulthood entirely defined by managing deep inner anxiety by continuing to fix everything for everyone else. At age 7, you basically figured out that making yourself extremely useful, making yourself the fixer, was the absolute best way to stabilize a really shaky environment. You essentially traded a carefree childhood for a full-time job. And the real tragedy here? You never formally resigned from it.
Moving on to Section 2, Understanding Responsibility Overload, the clinical mechanics of carrying too much.
Okay, so the absolutely crucial point here is understanding this concept of responsibility overload, because this is the exact mechanism that strips away a normal childhood and swaps it out for premature maturity. As you can see in the definition, we're not talking about a kid simply doing household chores or taking out the trash. This is intense psychological weight. It's a child literally being tasked with carrying the emotional stability of the adults around them. And when a developing brain is subjected to that kind of overload, it rapidly rewires itself just to survive. It learns very quickly that safety isn't freely given. Safety has to be earned by being hyper-competent and fiercely responsible.
Which brings us to Section 3, the coping fixer, controlling the environment to soothe the self. This is where you become the coping fixer. And notice the specific wording we're using here. This isn't just someone who's naturally helpful. This is an archetype that obsessively uses control over their environment and their relationships to desperately manage their own internal anxiety. This is a massive paradigm shift in how we actually view the golden child. Society looks at the overachiever, the one who volunteers for every committee, the one who flawlessly organizes the most chaotic project at work, and everyone thinks, wow, they really have it all together. But the coping fixer is actually highly anxious. By fixing your problems, by controlling the external world, they're really just attempting to soothe their own internal storm. Their extreme helpfulness? It's actually a highly sophisticated coping mechanism.
So let's get into Section 4, 10 signs of parentification. Are you the golden child?
Let's look closely at these 10 signs. I want you to honestly ask yourself how many of these behaviors are actively driving your day-to-day life right now. Are you carrying this immense sense of hyper-responsibility for things that are completely not your fault? Do you experience adult-level anxiety the second things slip out of your control? There's that compulsive fixing we were just talking about, which drives your constant overachieving. Maybe you find yourself constantly stuck in emotional mediation, playing the referee between friends or coworkers just like you used to do at home. There's that intense need for control which inevitably leads right to severe burnout. You act like a sponge for other people's stress, you're mourning a childhood lost to duty, and you're functioning as that exhausting noise-canceling presence we talked about. Look, if you're mentally checking off almost every single point on this list, you are actively living the legacy of the parentified child right now.
Let's reframe this in Section 5, Shaping Traumatic Intelligence, the profound outcome of a parentified upbringing.
So this really begs a massive question. When you combine that intense responsibility overload with the constant humming anxiety of a coping fixer, What exactly does that yield in an adult? I mean, obviously we know it yields burnout for sure, but what is the actual cognitive result of spending decades of your life reading rooms and managing adults? Let's take a look.
It results in what's known as traumatic intelligence. And this is a brilliant but incredibly exhausting hyper-awareness that takes your childhood survival tactics and transforms them into a very unique, undeniable form of adult intelligence. Honestly, it's exactly why you're so good at your job. It's why you can anticipate a crisis before anyone else in the room even senses a tiny shift in the wind. Your brain was essentially trained in a high-stakes emotional boot camp. So the extreme confidence you display today, it isn't just natural talent. It was forged directly through the trauma of premature parentification. And acknowledging that doesn't take away from your accomplishments at all, but it radically reframes the heavy cost at which they were acquired.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. Now that you can actually recognize your overachieving as traumatic intelligence, how will you use this insight to finally stop being everyone else's noise-canceling device? Because once you realize that your immediate impulse to fix everything is a childhood survival mechanism and not some lifelong moral obligation, you actually gain the power to put the burden down. You can be highly competent without being entirely consumed by it. So take a really hard look at where you're spending your emotional energy today. And ask yourself, are you actually fixing a current problem, or are you still just trying to soothe that 7-year-old fixer inside you?